Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I've been away, for a week or two, hence the lack of recording. So anyway, back in business now, and we're looking tonight at another of Sean McMeekin's books. You'll remember I talked a lot about his book Ottoman Endgame. He has got a book, Stalin's War, a really interesting thesis about Stalin, the Second World War, and the kind of really turning a lot of the kind of conventional ideas that we have about Stalin's role on their heads. Many of the ideas about Stalin's perceived weaknesses in 1941, and the kind of the idea that the Stalinist regime was particularly on the back foot. So Sean McMeekin makes the argument that even despite the massive reversals of 1941, the regime itself was fairly intact, and that a lot of the kind of the intelligence groundwork, espionage groundwork, had been ongoing since the mid-1930s. He's got a lot to say about the levels of infiltration of the American government under Roosevelt, suggesting that later on during the McCarthyite era, that despite the kind of the viciousness of McCarthyism, McCarthy himself, even though he didn't know a great deal of he didn't know what he didn't know, he wasn't completely wrong either. Okay, but we're going to turn our thoughts to the origins of the Nazi-Soviet pact. So one of the arguments put forward in the book about the Popular Front era, the mid-1930s, when Stalin decided that his deliberate kind of attacks on social democrat parties and the kind of the weaponization of disputes between social democrats and communists had been a huge tactical error. He decided that there were some opportunities to form Popular Front governments, particularly this leads Stalin to meddle in the Spanish Civil War. Contrary to what's been argued by some historians, Stalin had little real interest in seeing the Spanish Republic survive. He gave arms to the Spanish Republic in drips and drabs, really in sort of the most minimal of amounts, particularly also very minimal amount of personnel. Stephen Kotkin paints a very dramatic picture of Stalin's tanks saving Madrid, which to some extent is true, but this one battle a victory does not make. Anyway, I'm going to look at the book Stalin's War now, and here we are looking at the period throughout 1939, in chapter 5, Courting Hitler. It was no accident that Stalin distanced himself from collective security in March 1939, just as Britain got serious about it, writes McMeekin. The closer the Western powers and Hitler drew towards war over Poland, the harder it would be for Stalin to pretend that bringing about such a conflict was not his most cherished foreign policy objective. Litvinov's collective security chatter had served a diplomatic purpose. This is Maxim Litvinov, Stalin's foreign policy spokesman, for his foreign policy commissar, before obviously he was pulled because of his Jewish background and replaced by Vyacheslav Molotov. But only as long as Stalin had not had to pledge the Soviets to intervene in a real armed conflict against Hitler, as Britain would surely now demand that he do, and to help Poland, one of Russia's traditional enemies and a serious Soviet military opponent as recently as 1920. So the point that they're making here is that Stalin's anti-Nazism in 1939, as we later find out by him signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of that year, is really kind of highly superficial. He did see Hitler as a threat, but that was as far as his opposition to Hitler really went, as far as the threat pertained to the Soviet Union. When it came to the integrity of Poland, he was committed to ending the territorial integrity of Poland. For a variety of reasons, Stalin throughout the 1930s had viewed Poland as one of the greatest threats to the Soviet Union. He had bitter memories. He was closely involved with the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1920 and the humiliating defeat outside Warsaw on the Vistula. And so he had a lot invested in the defeat of Poland and its subjugation and division. So, joining with Britain's increasingly robust stance towards Germany as 1939 wore on, Britain signs the Anglo-Polish Defence Pact in 1939, in March 1939, following the fall of Czechoslovakia. A hint of the true face of Soviet foreign policy was provided immediately after Prime Minister Chamberlain proclaimed his fateful guarantee of Polish independence in the House of Commons in March 31st, 1939. Not that is, of Poland's territorial integrity, as neighbours with designs on Polish territory noticed. Chamberlain's statement has received opprobrium over the years, much of it deserved. Hitler read the loose guarantee of Polish independence as a green light for adjusting Poland's borders, even as Poland's Foreign Minister, Józef Beck, took Chamberlain's declaration as a British blank cheque, a solemn vow to intervene militarily if Germany threatened Poland's independence. Both interpretations suffered from wishful thinking, enabled by Chamberlain's poor choice of words. The upshot was the simultaneous encouragement of German diplomatic bullying and the stiffening of Polish resistance to it, which ratcheted up the odds of war. In fairness to Chamberlain, writes Sean McMeekin, there were good reasons for the subtle wording. To have guaranteed the entirety of Polish territory, as Chamberlain's critics have often insisted he should have done, would have been to recognise the opportunistic Polish seizure of Teschen from the Czechs 2 days after Munich, an act of territorial larceny that, like Hungary's seizure of southern Slovakia, had played a role in the destruction of Czechoslovakia that Hitler had just completed. Poland, as Chamberlain knew, had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in January 1934 as a hedge against Soviet aggression. Foreign Minister Beck had visited the Führer's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden as recently as January 5, 1939, where Hitler had proposed a deal to compensate Warsaw with more territory at Czech expense, Carpatho-Ruthenia, in today's Ukraine, in exchange for Poland turning over Danzig, or Gdansk as it's now known, and the Polish corridor to Germany. Beck, though happy to pocket Teschen in the wake of Munich, was now having second thoughts, and he refused. However alarming Hitler's recent behaviour had been, his bullying of Chamberlain at Munich, to the brutal state-enabled Kristallnacht pogrom against Jews and Jewish-owned businesses carried out across Germany on November the 9th and 10th, 1938, to the occupation of Prague on March the 15th, Poland was not blameless in the Czechoslovakian tragedy. Personally affronted as he was by Hitler's move into Prague, Chamberlain had to consider opinion in the cabinet and the Commons. The Liberal and Labour opposition, however, wary of Hitler and Nazism, were reluctant to be drawn into war against Germany by a Tory government. The Tories in Chamberlain's cabinet, including the Foreign Secretary Viscount Halifax, were no less leery. An unconditional guarantee of Poland's integrity would have pleased the gung-ho Winston Churchill, but his belligerent anti-Hitler stance was still a minority position in the party, as had been made clear by Churchill's exclusion from the last two Tory cabinets, including this one. It bears repeating that Winston Churchill was a political non-entity before May 1940. He was a member of Chamberlains War cabinet once hostilities begin. Yes, this is true. However, for the most part, he's a political outsider. Why? Because Winston Churchill routinely adopted the most preposterous and unfashionable and often laughable views. It was Winston Churchill who backed Edward VIII during the divorce crisis, and even appeared in Parliament roaring drunk, proposing that a King's Party be established. It was Winston Churchill who opposed any semblance of Home Rule and threatened, suggested it be dealt with violently. This is Home Rule in India. Even when most Conservatives, Liberals and Labour Party members looked objectively at India and recognised that some sort of dominion status would eventually have to be entertained. And unfortunately, into all of this comes Churchill's often quite mixed rhetoric on what to do about European fascism. He was initially quite fond of Italian fascism, seeing it as a marvellous opportunity to deal with unruly Bolsheviks, and he becomes a convert to the cause of opposing appeasement to Nazi Germany, but he converts that reasonably late in the day. So Churchill, we have to really kind of look at Churchill in a meaningful context, which as a historical figure, particularly here in Great Britain, is very, very difficult to do. And if we don't, then none of this makes a great deal of sense. Moreover, a commitment to defend Poland at all costs, like an invitation for Churchill to join the cabinet, would have been understood by Hitler as a virtual commitment to fight. For this reason, Chamberlain could not have issued one without risking the collapse of his government. Seeking political and diplomatic cover, Chamberlain had tried to enlist not only French but also Soviet support for a statement guaranteeing Polish independence, which, when you consider it, it's sort of an absurdity really, that any Polish government might be invited to even consider such a thing. Despite his own misgivings about Stalin, Chamberlain had arranged a meeting with Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to London, in the hope of extracting a Soviet endorsement. Carefully, Maisky had told Chamberlain that he might say on his own authority that the USSR appreciated the principles embodied in the statement regarding Poland, so long as it did not quote Maisky, Litvinov or Stalin as having done so on the record. But even this qualified endorsement of Chamberlain's Polish guarantee was rescinded when Litvinov informed the British ambassador to Moscow, Sir William Seeds, on April 1st, 1939, that Maisky had been misunderstood and that Chamberlain's statement on Poland was not at all appreciated. Britain, Litvinov told Seeds, could pursue its own policy. The Soviet government would stand aside. As if to underscore Moscow's distance from the Western powers over Poland, 3 days later, the Soviet news agency TASS emphatically denied a French news report that the Soviet Union had undertaken or promised to undertake to supply Poland in the event of a war with war materials and to deny its raw materials market to Germany. The truth was that the Soviet Union had given no such promise and assumed no such obligation. So much for the supposed Soviet commitment to collective security. As we know, Stalin at this point was entertaining the details of the Nazi-Soviet pact, which was in large part an economic pact. It was a non-aggression pact, but it was also a very extensive trade deal in which raw materials from the Soviet Union would flood into the war industries of Nazi Germany. This, from the kind of the Marxist-Leninist perspective, was how Stalin imagined that Hitler could be appeased. Stalin was aware that he wasn't prepared for war, and even though the Red Army was actually very, very well equipped at this point. Its entire command structure had been destroyed by Stalin during the purges. So Stalin knew that he had to play for time, what kind of pay as well, really, to be honest with you. He had to play for time, and how you did that, in his eyes, was you appeased Germany's capitalists. Why? Because in a Marxist-Leninist reading of what Nazism is that it is really the attack dog of the capitalist classes. It's not quite that, really. I mean, Nazism is a racial phenomena that doesn't really fit in quite easily into that sort of categorization. Nazi capital was not in charge of Germany, or German capital was not in charge of the Nazi regime in 1939 by any stretch of the imagination. Stalin believed that German capitalists getting cheap raw materials from Russia wouldn't think about invading Russia and upsetting this wonderful source of raw materials, but that's to misunderstand Nazism. And if there was an economic thinking going on at the time, it was Hitler's economic thinking, which was really, once we conquer the Soviet Union, Germany's economic problems will be over because we'll have all this land and territory that we can farm. The German people will eat, and we'll be able to wage war against whoever we like because we will have the resources to do it. Hitler was very, very fixated on the fact that famine had been used as a weapon by the Allied powers against Germany during the First World War, and that Germany had been reduced to starvation by Royal Naval blockades, which lasted until the end of the Paris Peace Conference. So he was very mindful that food would be the way in which you could secure German security, German prosperity. Still, writes Schormann, despite his own deep-seated hostility towards Poland, for diplomatic reasons Stalin could not simply cast off all disguise. On April 17, 1939, he authorised Litvinov to discuss the possibility of a mutual assistance pact with Britain and France. Significantly, however, Litvinov instructed Maisky to leave the initiative to the British and French. In a sign of the bad faith with which he viewed the Western powers, Stalin, that very same day, authorised his ambassador to Berlin, A.F. Merikhalov, to visit the German Foreign Ministry in order to reassure the German State Secretary Richard von Weizsäcker that Stalin's foreign policy was in no way anti-German. Weizsäcker assured Merikhalov that there was no reason why Russia should not live with us on a normal footing, and from normal our relations might become better and better. For all that, Neville Chamberlain had been abused for his naivety and his reading of Hitler. It's worth noting here that the British Prime Minister was perfectly justified in his wariness of Stalin. Soviet Russia, Chamberlain wrote his sister on March 26th, was both hated and respected by many of the smaller states, notably Poland, Romania and Finland. After the Russians disowned his March 31st statement on Poland, the Prime Minister concluded, with justification, that the USSR did not have the same aims and objects as we have, or any sympathy with democracy as such. She is afraid of Germany and Japan and would be delighted to see other people fight them. Well, this is precisely what Stalin presumed the Western allies, the British and the French, were looking to happen as well. Stalin's worldview was that the immediate threats facing Germany, facing the Soviet Union, Germany, Poland and Japan, were a sort of a second tier of threats would be Britain, France and America. And that these were all, to his view, capitalist powers, and that they were all part of the encirclement of the Soviet Union. The second tier of kind of new imperialist powers, Germany, Italy and Japan, were going to be part, in Stalin's view, of a kind of like a civil war amongst capitalism. Lenin had basically suggested that the First World War was as much. It was a civil war amongst capitalism. And now there was these two kind of modes of capitalism. This sort of the Atlanticist capital of Britain and America, and a new kind of violent nationalism, this revanchist kind of catching up imperialism of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And Stalin, believed that they would fall out amongst themselves, and that there would be a long war in Europe, and this would be something, in his eyes, probably like the First World War, where everyone would get bogged down. It would. The First World War came close to spreading revolution across Europe from Russia in 1918, and in 1939, Stalin believed that finally the revolution would happen. 20 years late, but it would succeed, and that the capitalism would finally destroy itself, and that if Stalin was able to stay out of this and direct the enemy, to direct his enemies against one another, then the prospects of eventually being able to sweep the Red Army across an exhausted, broken Europe, fomenting revolutions and Bolshevik or Soviet governments wherever they arrived, this would be kind of child's play. You'd have the Red Army at the English Channel, and in a way, by the summer of 1940, this is kind of what happens. The only problem in the summer of 1940 is that Stalin needs the French and the British to put up a long fight. A speedy victory for fascism is not what is required. A speedy victory for fascism is more problems, more trouble. A speedy victory for Hitler means that Hitler can then look hungrily at the Soviet Union, realizing that the Western design, had it ever existed, of sending the Nazis and the Soviets against one another, that hadn't happened, and the Soviet ambition that the Nazis and the Western Allies destroy each other hadn't exactly happened. In fact, Hitler had triumphed, which was the nightmare scenario for Stalin. Sean McMeekin writes about France and where they sat within this crisis. The beleaguered Edouard Daladier government in Paris received no better treatment in Moscow. France's military attaché in the city, Colonel Auguste Antoine Palissé, had been trying to cultivate contacts in the Soviet High Command for 2 years. Although France had been theoretically a Soviet ally since 1935, Palissé was not even allowed to attend Red Army manoeuvres. As a disgruntled Colonel Palissé reported to Paris, Stalin's spy chief Lavrenti Beria had placed him under round-the-clock NKVD surveillance. In June and July 1938, because to furnish intelligence requested in Paris as the Czechoslovak crisis was breaking, he'd been asking too many questions about the Soviet military posture. On April 13th, 1939, as the showdown over Poland was heating up, Palissé visited the Soviet Defense Ministry to request an urgent audience. He was rebuffed without explanation. After being rebuked by his superiors for failing to furnish decent intelligence on the Red Army, Palissé reminded the French High Command in a plaintive report filed on October the 19th that I assume I posed here in an atmosphere of revolutionary terror, a terror which has still not ceased today, and which renders it all but impossible to enter into genuine relations with Soviet military personalities. Palissé added dryly that relations between our two countries have not been, in general, of a nature tending to facilitate my mission. Although Stalin's government had been dropping lumps of coal into French and British laps all winter, the first sign of genuine revolution in the Soviet foreign policy came on April 27, 1939, when Litvinov and Maisky were summoned to Moscow for consultation. A dramatic scene was enacted in the Kremlin as Litvinov came in for vicious abuse at the hands of Vyacheslav Scriabin, the Bolshevik name for Molotov, meaning hammer. The chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, the hammer to Stalin's steel during the Great Terror years. Molotov had worked closely with the Voizd. Voizd is the name for Stalin, means boss. Drawing up purge lists and death quotas, they co-signed 3,167 execution orders on a single day, November the 12th, 1938. The atmosphere, Maisky later recalled, was as tense as it could get. Molotov became violent, colliding with Litvinov incessantly, accusing him of every kind of mortal sin. Stalin puffed at his pipe during Molotov's tirade, making clear to Maisky that Molotov, an old Bolshevik, an unsentimental foreign policy opportunist, was now in favour. Next week, the hammer came down. On the night of May the 3rd, 1939, the Soviet Foreign Ministry on Kuznetsky Most was surrounded by NKVD troops in a blunt coup that saw Litvinov and his top appointees physically removed from the premises, along with virtually all Jewish employees. As Molotov recalled, Stalin had ordered him to purge the Foreign Ministry of Jews. Not only was Stalin jettisoning Litvinov's policy of anti-Hitler collective security, but he was extending an anti-Semitic olive branch to the Nazis by purging Jews from the top Soviet foreign policy establishment and turning it over to a Gentile, Molotov. Stalin was courting Hitler. Okay, so we'll resume this in a week or two, but as I said, this is a really, really good book. I do urge you to get it if you can get your hands on a copy. Stalin's War, a really interesting kind of revisionist take on Stalinist foreign policy. Anyway, thanks so much, and we're back to business as usual now. So all the best, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye bye.